Welcome. Today we want to talk to you about breathing new life into Apache Oozie, and in particular focusing on the Apache Ambari Workflow Manager as well. Apache Oozie has seen a lot of recent change, and it's been quite awesome to see the community evolve and ramp up. So we're really excited to talk to you about this today. I want to understand, though, for those of you who already use Oozie, do you use it today? Let's just see a show of hands. Do you use Oozie? Awesome. Do you use it in production? Very cool. Kind of gets more complicated. Do you use it with Kerberos security? Very cool. And does anyone use Hue with Oozie? Another way to view. Very cool. And how many workflows do you have in production? For those of you 1 to 10 workflows? Cool, cool. 10 to 50? Cool, cool. And how about 50 plus? Nice. And those workflows, do you have a lot of actions in them? How many folks, relatively simple workflows, 1 to 10? Okay. Orchestrating slightly bigger things, 10 to 50? Cool. Any of you guys just have crazy workflows, 50 plus actions in them? Okay, awesome. And do you use Oozie with anything that you kind of find unusual, such as HBase requires a little bit of tinkering? Cool. Spark? Fantastic. Python. And in particular, those of you who use it with Python, keep your hands up. But let me know, do you use it with PySpark or with Python doing something not with PySpark? Okay. And deployment automation. Do you deploy your jars for your workflows through Oozie or anything like that? Okay. Now, really exciting topic. It's been around with us now for a number of years. Who likes XML in this room? It's astounding. No one raised their hand. Does anyone have a favorite editor, though, for Oozie workflows? No? Okay. Well, with that, we want to talk on all of these parts today. And we want to kind of ramp up by explaining some of the workflow managers that are out there.
Yeah, so hi. Thank you, everybody, for coming. So this is an interesting topic, right? And in the big data world, there's a rich ecosystem of workflow managers, and it becomes a religion war on which one is the most popular. So the ones that are available today that are popular and have some buzz around them are Airflow, Luigi by Spotify, Azkaban by LinkedIn, and of course Oozie. Oozie was developed by Yahoo, and Airflow was developed by Airbnb. Just on how they've been written, the Luigi and Airflow have been written in Python, and Oozie was written in Java. I'm not sure what Azkaban was written in. Now, in terms of origins of Oozie, it's a scheduling system, right? This is how you would run your workflows with, sets of actions on schedule, consistently on a distributed system. It runs in terms of DAGs, directed acyclical graphs. There are workflow jobs, there are coordinated jobs, and there's also bundles. It's integrated very well with the Hadoop ecosystem, right? There's a rich set of actions that you can run it with, and it's scalable, it's battle tested, mature. Some of the actions available today are down below, and we're actually going to introduce a few more in the next phase of Oozie development. So the release timeline, it started in 2010 at Yahoo. For the very first 2 releases, it was a private source code at Yahoo, and then it was open sourced on GitHub. Then it went into Apache Incubator, and 3.x release was the one that was in Apache. And the way to read this would be, in 2010, it only had concepts of workflows. 2011, with the version 2, introduced coordinators, and then bundles were introduced in 3.x release, also the release where we introduced HBase credentials. 4.x release is the current stable and probably the one that will be EOL very soon. But that one introduced Hive HCatalog actions and also Spark integration. Oozie Server HA was also added there. 5.0 is the latest, and this is the one that's been actively worked on by the community. It removes support for Hadoop 1, adds support for Hadoop 3, right? So this is relevant for this year. And major change would be the Yarn application master instead of a MapReduce launcher for your workflows. So, we typically, I work with customers and we typically get a lot of complaints about Oozie. I definitely have some scars from working with Oozie myself, so I can relate. Typically it's, we hate XML. It's really hard to debug, really ugly UI, Java, right? So it really depends, what you're comfortable with, and you have to really dig into what the actual complaints is, because Clay and I, we were looking at some of the more interesting Oozie versus Airflow topics on Twitter, on Stack Overflow, and some of those complaints you can actually relate to many other projects in the ecosystem. So this is a really recent complaint tweet I got, and let's just go one by one, right? So launcher jobs as map tasks, right? So this is slow. It runs a launcher container. It has a long overhead, right? It runs for a long time, then it starts the actual action. So there's a lot of overhead.
It depends on the job history server for MapReduce, for example, too.
Right. Ugly UI, I can also agree with that one. The confusing object model, right? The workflows, bundles, coordinators. I actually think it's pretty simple to understand, and I'm fine with that one, but I'll leave it to the.
And hopefully from looking at the Workflow Manager today, you'll be able to actually rationalize about that. If you still have questions, workflow, coordinator, and bundler, I think visualization really helps there.
Right. And then complicated deployment, yes, I agree. DAG visualizations, SLA, no SLAs, that's not true. Fine-grained authorization, and then easy access to log files. All right. So most of the talk today is on Oozie 5, but when we're talking in terms of Workflow Manager, it's still in the 4.x release. But anyway, launcher jobs in 5.0, we introduced, a community introduced Oozie Launcher AM. Basically, this makes your workflows run a lot faster. There's no overhead on launching these containers, and it just runs. And your jobs will be automatically faster because there's no overhead on the MapReduce. Dated UI, there's an active.
Actually, yeah, key thing too is the logging with the Yarn. So now you don't have nearly as many different subsystems. Your jars, class path dependency issues really can become much simpler with the Yarn launchers as well. So I think this is a huge improvement, and one that's incredibly exciting. For folks who are used to debugging through MapReduce, especially starting something such as a Spark task with a MapReduce job, this really starts to make much more simplicity in the Oozie ecosystem and much easier to introduce to new users. For those of you who've been using Oozie for a long time, you've kind of learned, oh yeah, I have to navigate it this way. Now it makes a much more simple, consistent model.
Yes, thank you. So dated UI, the Oozie for the longest time been shipped with the EXT.js, which is old and has a bad licensing for an Apache project. So, community is addressing that in many interesting ways. There will be a screenshot in a later slide, but to overcome that, there's obviously Hue, there's also Workflow Manager, so depending what you're trying to solve here. Again, object model, I would tend to disagree, but that's not the topic for today's conversation.
One key thing, though, is this new development in the community. So for those of you who are familiar with Airflow, perhaps evaluating Airflow, and either way have seen this Fluent API concept, instead of having to define an Oozie job as an XML and being able to walk through and say, hey, I've got this flow of tasks. Instead, I want to see that as code. I want to be able to rationalize about that. This is a huge change now, being able to actually, and Oozie 5.1 is what it's targeted for. It just got merged recently. There's now a Java Fluent API, so you can actually walk through and declare your workflows as code. Yes. So this is a very big change in the Oozie community. And
we'll have a slide on that too. So SLA has been available since 4.x, so anyone running HDP 2 and up probably had it. Working with Oozie 4 and up. In CDH, I'm not familiar with versions. But anyway, 4.x is an old release. SLAs were available for the longest time. Fine-grained authorization, right? So we want to add more authorizations on top of what any specific action can do. And this is where community is addressing that. And then there's a diagnostic tool that was shipped with 5.x, really makes debugging Oozie easier. So this is one of the mockups that a member of the community is working on. This is implemented in React. There's two other JIRAs where they're playing around with Vue.js, sorry, wrong project, and also Angular, right? So it really depends on the taste, but I think this looks really nice and fresh, and this particular author is modeling Hue here, but I think it's nice and fresh, refreshing here.
And a key thing too is users of Oozie. Certainly we offer the Oozie JIRAs here, and it's useful to make your ideas known. So this Oozie JIRA here is for the React mockup, but definitely feel free to go on there and let the community know, hey, this looks good, or this misses something that I just always need. Why isn't it in the UI? So definitely, I think the community encourages a lot more feedback. So I want to encourage you guys as users.
Definitely, and Oozie is really backed by a sophisticated REST API. So arguing on what the UI looks like, I mean, it just takes someone who's knowledgeable in writing JavaScript, right, and writing something interesting here. So the launcher AM. This is the old way of running the Oozie jobs, workflows, right? It's, if you can look at the application type, it says map reduce. So the really big feature of 5.x is that it's now application master, yarn application, basically. And again, I've seen it in action. It's pretty fast, right? There's no overhead on 45 seconds of starting a job, so.
You don't have to wait for that MapReduce job history server integration anymore too, so we can get much faster feedback.
Right, so I'm actually excited about good documentation, right? For the longest time, I couldn't stand looking at Oozie documentation, but someone from the community came out and wrote a nice skin for Oozie 5, so I spend a lot of time there now. For the longest time also, the DAG visualization has been shipped with this ugly one on the left, and then there's a lot more interesting one on the right. That's the new library. It's there was vulnerability issues, and it's no longer maintained, so they replaced it with GraphViz. Oozie Fluent Job API that Clay referred to. It's probably hard to see, but this allows for debugging your jobs, right? Testing them, checking into source control, and really automating how you create workflows and actions, in a developer-friendly way. This is probably the biggest attack vector for some of the ecosystem projects, but we're trying to fill the gap in the community on this, right? The next step would probably be to extend it to other languages, but this is in Java.
For those of you who aren't familiar with the Fluent API too, just to kind of walk through how this works out a little bit, you end up here with a workflow scope, and within that workflow scope, we've actually declared a shell action. That shell action has a number of properties, for example, like the name of the shell action. Similarly, we can add other properties to it, such as the job tracker, name node. Actually, now it's the resource manager, but our slide's a little old. And then similarly with the various config properties. So you actually can see this as a builder pattern in Java.
Right, and Workflow Manager solves one problem, right, of actually drag and drop actions on the canvas and building your workflows that way. This is the other way, right, for those that are about scripting, about coding your pipelines. And one of the more interesting features of this implementation is that something like fork and decision nodes are implied. So, once you start working with this, you can see how powerful this is. And this will be a big buzz in this project going forward.
So let me take it over from here and discuss Apache Ambari. So Apache Oozie is one freestanding project. Apache Ambari is another freestanding project. In particular, Apache Ambari provides a number of different focuses on what you can do with your cluster. You can actually provision and stand up a Hadoop cluster with Apache Ambari. You can manage the lifecycle of that cluster once it's been installed and once it's operating. And then it offers a number of tools around that operation, such as the monitoring of a Hadoop cluster. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. Within that monitoring stack, there's some stuff that we won't, such as a metric system. The Ambari metric system is a freestanding metric system within Ambari that tells you everything you want to know about your cluster. Everything can report into it. You can get visualizations into your cluster. Similarly, it has an alerting framework off those metrics. Perhaps you want to know if a log error, error is being logged. It has alerting frameworks for those types of things. What we're going to focus today, though, is the dashboards for monitoring the Hadoop clusters. And with that, they call that an Ambari view. And so the Ambari views framework is a very nice pluggable system whereby you can actually develop different web applications that give you insights into the Hadoop cluster. In particular, third parties can also develop to fit this framework. What we're going to look at here, though, is the kind of key takeaways. You don't actually have to run an Ambari cluster for the management. Perhaps you're a Cloudera customer, you use CDH. In the case of Bloomberg, we actually don't use Ambari for the management of our cluster, we use Chef. But we're still able to deploy these. Third parties can build views that actually plug in. So if you've got some independent software vendor that you work with that plugs into your Hadoop cluster, you can actually push them and ask them, hey, I want a pane of glass to look at my Hadoop cluster and all of that together. And the Ambari views system is nicely pluggable for that. Or perhaps you've got internal software you'd like to get visibility into. Right now, the major views that Ambari itself ships, however, though, are a yarn capacity scheduler view, an HDFS files view so that you can kind of get visibility into your file system. There's an Apache Hawk view out there, and an Apache Hive, Apache Pig, Apache Storm, Apache Tez. And then similarly, a yarn application timeline service, jobs view. And the key thing today, though, is there's an Oozie Workflow Manager view. And this is really, really exciting. Now, it's worth pointing out there's some older or different projects out there. Cloudera Hue's been around for a long time. It provides that pane of glass. It doesn't provide the management infrastructure, as far as I know, or the monitoring and alerting as much, but it provides a nice pane of glass as well. Or there's tons of bespoke applications out there. I believe it was Foursquare, for example, had an Oozie UI that one could plug in as well a number of years ago. With this, the Workflow Manager for Ambari, it's got a lot of motivation behind it. Basically, we all love XML, as we established at the beginning of this talk, and therefore, we can just visualize it in our head. But, for everyone else who can't, it's really verbose. And if you want to actually understand what it looks like, this now provides a GUI so that you can, as Artem was saying, drag and drop and be able to actually build a workflow. It also similarly makes sure that you don't do as many errors. I know all of us love typing config strings that might be 40, 50 characters and making sure we didn't typo one. But now those typos can be flagged up, and we can actually get those errors in real time before we submitted it to Oozie and gotten an error back. Similarly, if we want to actually go find our workflows, it gives a nice browser-based view. That browser-based view even works with S3. And similarly, this workflow view, the Workflow Manager view, can actually replace the Oozie UI. So you don't have to actually use the XJS, that's a little antiquated at this point, to view your workflows. Some really key stuff there for those who do have really big workflows. I don't think anyone in the room mentioned they had more than 50 actions, but Workflow Manager can actually view a 300+ node action workflow and be able to actually visualize it. So key part here too is it's scalable. Oozie, for those of you who might come from very large scale operations, you can scale out quite wide, and it'll actually be able to work with multiple servers. Workflow Manager similarly is a relatively stateless application. It queries Oozie for its state. And so you can similarly scale it horizontally. Worked out quite nicely that way. Now, the Workflow Manager editor is a very nice, easy UI. And let me hand it off to Artem, who is our UI master here.
All right, so the two concepts you need to remember is an editor and a dashboard, right? Editor is where you will author your workflows, right? It will be a workflow coordinator or bundle. And then you have a dashboard where you will see the, the schedules and then kill jobs, start jobs, whatever. This is the dashboard view, and this is where you can actually sort and search on your workflows. The very powerful feature of it is that you can chain your filters, right, and find the specific workflow that you're looking for. So that was a nice addition on top of what Oozie provides out of the box. So we have very good documentation on Workflow Manager. We spent a lot of time on bringing that to market, and this is a screenshot from there, but I will go through a demo and just cover some of these bits and pieces. Hand it over back to you. Okay. I will cover it in the demo.
Okay. So with that, I want to try to get your minds expanded about what is the art of possible with Oozie. So I've been working with Oozie since about 2010, doing a number of different integrations with it. And just chatting with Artem, who sees a number of different customers and what they do with Oozie, we started going, well, what can you do with Oozie? And some of the interesting stuff that was obvious to me, and Artem hadn't actually seen other folks doing it, is you can actually do a lot of non-traditional types of Hadoop workflows. Oozie is a highly available distributed workflow manager. Now, it happens to run on your Hadoop cluster because it's a convenient, highly available place, and it has storage, and it has compute. But with that, your Hadoop cluster likely talks to a lot of SQL servers, talks to a lot of traditional relational databases, and oftentimes you're interacting with it. In projects I've done in the past, actually being able to schedule SQL maintenance operations, after I've uploaded a table to a relational database that might be doing a view, I can switch which table is the active table through a stored procedure called through Oozie, for example. I can actually launch a SQL server on Linux and Docker now, thanks to Yarn having Docker support, which is just kind of crazy. But at that point, I actually can have an integration test. This was a big challenge in 2010 when talking to SQL Server. How do I get an integration test environment? That's now something I can run on my Hadoop cluster and I can schedule with Oozie. So all of these types of things are non-traditional Hadoop workloads. There's still traditional Hadoop technologies that you might still need to do administrative tasks with. Warming a cache, for example, is something that's maybe something as an application team very key. You want to make sure HBase cache has your data before your day starts. You want to make sure your LAP cache has your data before somebody releases a BI tool out to production. So with that, the administrative tasks, though, as a systems operator, what do I need to do? There's a number of log cleanup tasks. You might have Yarn logs that are spanning, I think in one talk earlier this conference, somebody said they had 50% of their HDFS was covered by Yarn logs. It's nice to have log rotate on Linux. You can do that with Oozie as well. Similarly, you might want to clean up crashed or abandoned Hive temporary data. You might have a big join out there that left just a small number of terabytes of data running around. You can do that with Oozie, or a user may have just left it around for a year. Clean it up with Oozie every so often. And then similarly, HBase management. And this is really near and dear to our hearts at Bloomberg. We do a bunch of HBase. We use a bunch of Oozie. So with that, I want to talk about some workflow manager examples with HBase. So we're going to talk about how you have to set up Oozie, both the server and the client-side workflows. I want to talk about data definitions of HBase tables, as well as ACLs, and what that might look like through Oozie in different ways. And I want to talk about compactions, because that's always pretty near and dear when you have a write-heavy use case in HBase. And so the HBase setup that you need in an Oozie server is a bit complicated, unfortunately, but it makes sense when you start to break it down. The server code needs to be able to talk to HBase, so it needs to understand what HBase is. Java world, that means we need some jars. So in particular, we need to support delegation tokens if it's a secure cluster, so we need to make sure that in the libexec directory of Oozie, that we have the HBase server jar. And similarly, we need to make sure in Oozie site that we've told it that, hey, you're going to need to get delegation tokens. And this is the power of Oozie in my mind, the fact that it actually integrates with the ecosystem to the point that it can say, hey, cbenzig, my user, you've actually got access to HBase. You don't need to ship a key tab or anything like that. I'm Oozie. I've got permissions. I can proxy that for you. Now, the server jars there, you've got a nice list of them, and when these slides are posted, you can copy and paste at will. But the key part then in the client code is much simpler. So now as a systems operator, I can tell my clients that they just need to add a credentials section, and that credentials section just needs to say that they need an HBase credential. The key part is you need to throw your normal HBase security settings in that credentials section, tell it that it's using Kerberos and things like that. But usually as an HBase client, you already know you have to do that just to talk to HBase through Java. So nothing too complex there. Now, as an HBase user, though, and especially as a system operator in my case, I tell people, hey, you have to create your own tables. You got to own that. You know your schema. That's not my job. That's your job. You're an application team. And they go, well, how do I create my schemas? We've got this great thing that's called Oozie. You can talk to it, and it will repeatably do whatever cluster I put you on. It will do the same thing when you run that workflow there. So with that, you can use the nice templating engine in Oozie, and you can actually template out the cluster bits. And again, right now it's job tracker for the current generation of HDP. It's job tracker Oozie 5. That will be the resource manager, resource master, excuse me. And similarly, we can actually say, hey, we don't want to just use HBase Shell. I'm lazy. I don't like writing a lot of Java code. So we can just use HBase Shell here, and we can run a Ruby script. Nice thing is HBase Shell makes it real easy to create a table. So here in the white box, we actually see the table creation, and it's a whopping, I think, 7 lines of code to be able to actually just make sure, hey, does this table exist? If it exists, I don't really have anything to do. I'm done. But if it doesn't exist, I should create that table, and with whatever parameters I need. And to me, this seems very easy. I didn't actually have to write more than 7 lines of code. I can very easily unit test that with an HBase mini cluster, and even test my workflow with an Oozie mini cluster. So it's a very lightweight way to be able to talk to HBase and set up my application. Now, as an operator, compactions are one of those things that gets fuzzy. As an application team, you might know that you needed to do an HBase compaction. As an application team, you know when you load your data in, and when you want to read your data. So it's an interesting trade-off. The HBase community has been having some questions about this, and HBase 19,528 brings in a really nice, lightweight, easy-to-use tool that you can, again, call as an Oozie shell action and just say, hey, I want to do an Oozie HBase major compaction, and I don't want it to take down all of my region servers, getting them busy with compaction. I just want to do one server at a time. And so I want to bring this to point that you can actually call this, again, through an Oozie workflow, just a simple shell action, nothing too complex, and be able to actually slowly walk through. Now, this is in HBase 2.0. I don't think anyone's yet shipping HBase 2.0 as part of their distribution, so Artem will actually walk through how to do this with Java code as well, just to kind of give a holistic point. And with that, some more resources. So we've kind of blown through a bunch of Oozie, hopefully expanded your mind a little bit, but there's definitely a lot more. Oops, Artem, thanks. There's a lot more that you can look at, such as the Oozie mailing list definitely is quite active to be able to actually ask questions, say, hey, this is what we're up to, just want to let people know, being able to ask questions if things don't work for you. And Artem has a pretty good series here on the 12 parts of how the Workflow Manager works. So you can actually look at that UI description and all the widgets that it provides. It also, he has a nice GitHub repo with Oozie examples. And kind of one nice thing, those Oozie examples, if you are new to Oozie, they all work great on a non-Kerberized cluster. I've got some Oozie presentations, in particular code deployment via Oozie. There's an Oozie Git action that's been soaking in the community and will hopefully be committed soon. That's talked about in there. And then there's questions beyond that for people who have very mature SDLCs, software development life cycles, continuous integration development, continuous integration, continuous deployment environments. I want to hear from you and understand, what would you do if you had a fully HA way to be able to make sure your clusters always had the jars you expected them to have, and always made sure that as an operator, you knew what your application teams were running, and as an application team, you always knew what your operators were running on your behalf. So with that, that's a presentation from ApacheCon, or there's an HBase multi-tenancy with Oozie that goes much deeper into the issues there that was presented last year at DataWorks Summit. Now onto the demo.
All right, thank you. So to get it started with, I'm going to point you to the GitHub repo where you can find this. And the very first example is the Oozie major compaction. So this is based on HDP repos, but you can adjust it to your version of HBase and just make it run. This is a Java action, so it doesn't really introduce anything other than HBase credentials, and they are running in a secure environment, so you should be familiar with that. Really easy to follow directions to make it run. So to make it run on Workflow Manager, it's actually really simple, and once you import this current workflow into Workflow Manager, it will know where everything is, and it will understand that these are HBase credentials, and it will put it in the right place. And the power and automation of Ambari will, make everything implicit, and so you can take for granted all of these things.
And to step back one moment, with Artem just logged into is that Ambari Views server. And in this case, if you go up to the upper right-hand side that's white with a little multiple squares, he went down to Workflow Manager and is into Workflow Manager already, ready to go.
Right. So I was going to get to that.
Oh.
But bottom line, the URL, you can easily find this, if you follow Clay. But Java action, I'm going to import it into Workflow Manager, and I'll just make a couple of changes based on my environment, and off I go. You don't have to worry about the job properties file anymore, because Ambari knows about all of your, where your Oozie server is, where your directory is, and it will just, makes it very simple to work with workflows, right? You don't have to go back to the Oozie UI, and just makes operationally much more sense. One other thing that I don't know if you noticed, but because this is in Ambari, right, you have to have access to HDFS. It will do the service checks for you, and it will make sure that you have access to your HDFS directory. This is where you can save your flows. You can also save your flows to S3, and it will also work with S3 from the Ambari Workflow Manager. Some of the other powerful features of Workflow Manager is that because it has a local database, you can save fully configured actions, right, to your local database or to HDFS and share those. That promotes collaboration with others, right? So if everybody's pointing to the same database, you can reuse actions fully filled out, right? So if security is of concern and you don't want your tenants to muck around with the properties, right, fill them out for them and reuse them. So it's really powerful concepts here. Again, Workflow Manager tries to solve the problem of drag and drop building of workflows, not to work with XML, right? For developer-friendly guys, there's a Fluent API coming. I'm pushing engineering to bring Fluent API into the Workflow Manager, and then we have the best of both worlds. All right, so I saw a lot of hands go up. I guess everybody's familiar with Oozie. I don't have to really dig into it, but for example's sake, this is a simple shell action, right? There's a Linux command, and then whatever else you want to do, and off I go. I can just say start, submit. I want to override my workflow, and it will just run. If I go to the dashboard, there it is, it's running. Here's the information about the job, the actual action, and link directly to the job that you can go to, and without drilling into, finding it on a MapReduce job, and finding the application, and then the container, and yada, yada, right? So you can go directly to the job, and you get your result here. All right, here. So very powerful and makes it very easy to use. But on top of that, you can see the flow graph, right? Where in the flow did the action fail? So we have coloring schemes here to show that. Access to the logs, to the error logs, audit logs, the actual configuration. That's your job properties, right? All of that is implied. So you inherit that right from Ambari. And then the actual workflow definition. Again, I've seen a few hands go up on a Python action, right? So you can run Python 2, Python 3. If you distributed the Python 3 libraries across your whole cluster, you can run it. I don't see why not. So back to the HBase compaction. I took that the workflow that Clay developed, right? I compiled the jar. I put it into the lib folder of my workflow directory. I imported the workflow XML from the HDFS, and this is how you would do it from here or from a local file system if you have it there. You can preview it. It is no magic. There's actual XML behind the scenes. I did have to remove the Kerberos authentication from this because this cluster is not Kerberos. And that's basically it. in terms of, this is the package name for the class. You can edit your credentials. It inherited the credentials, right? Now, if this was his cluster, these would apply, but it doesn't in my cluster. Then you can introduce new variables. You can, and here the other thing is, if you are familiar with running Oozie from before, right, with the job track, and Clay mentioned that, here it will already inherit the variable substitution with the resource manager. So I guess it's a neat thing here. Not much else to say here. So I submit this. Sorry. So, because in his XML, it does expect a realm, right, and a quorum. It knows about my resource manager address, it knows about my name node, and obviously the table name. So that's a variable that he has in his workflow, so it's expecting that. So it reads your XML, and it knows the variables it's expecting, right? So this was really cool that I don't have to, the very first version of the workflow manager that I was playing with, I was like, I'm going to catch them, right? I'm going to throw a variable at them that they don't know about. And I was surprised that they know this, and they expect that you will introduce your own variables, and it will reflect in the UI. You can actually validate before you run the jobs, right? So it does the syntax checks for you, and it makes it Oozie bearable. Sorry, Clay. Now, in the UI, there's the job. It will run. Flow graph, and then let's just wait for it to finish. Still running. Some other powerful features of Workflow Manager is you can, it will facilitate you creating your own action, your own kill nodes, right? So you can say, send an email in case of an error, or to redirect to something else, right? You can add those in here as well. So I learned about bundles from the Workflow Manager. I never played with the bundles, but working a few days with the Workflow Manager, I was like, okay, this makes sense to me, that you take a series of coordinators, and you make a one bundle out of it. And, so this makes working with Oozie, user-friendly. There's a lot of settings and properties you can tweak in here, right? Creating workflows, coordinators, bundles, right? It's all out of the box here. Managing assets is what I was talking about, where I said you can have your actions saved to a database. You can import them. You can copy and paste them from one workflow to another. So this makes it really fast to develop these.
So for my tenants, for example, there would be a compact table action in that palette that they could just drop into their workflows and say, you know what, every weekend we can kind of get by throughout the week not compacting our HBase tables, but you know what, I need that on the weekend. I don't have to think about it, I just drop it in, and then they just fill out that template, what's my table name, how many regions should be compacting at a time, et cetera.
So if you do look at the Java code, right, Clay was printing out to the command line that compacting the table, the table name. So you can see that in the Oozie, that it printed it out to the standard output. With that, we're happy to take some questions. And I'm curious about all the other use cases you can think of to apply. We got 11 minutes.
Come on, we need lots of questions. Actually, Artem, yeah, we can blew past the SLAs. Can you pull open the SLA tab in Workflow Manager? I think this is a key thing, too, that we get a lot of comments from our tenants on is, I really need to understand how to do SLAs. I've got this out-of-band process polling Oozie and trying to figure out if the job's done, and it just keeps doing that. Oozie, since the early versions of Oozie 4, has had SLA actions for being able to send you an email if your job's running long. Similarly, if you've got an enterprise workflow manager that you integrate Oozie with, it's got a JMS bus that you can actually connect to and see all the state transitions of your various jobs. So this is really powerful. But Workflow Manager tries to make it much simpler for just, hey, look, I need to make sure this runs by 5 p.m. every day, or this is done by market open every day. And so here you can actually fill out your times and who you want it to email and all of that.
Yeah, you can track if your job started later than expected, it finished later than expected, or it ran longer than expected. You can track all of these things with SLAs. And I do have an article on that as well. You can follow that tutorial and set this up. And this is a common misconception that Oozie doesn't have SLA monitoring as well. And I just had a question come up a couple of weeks ago from a customer. And how would you track that, right? Well, we have Oozie. We've been shipping Oozie for years, and it has these powerful features.
Yeah, so as far as like debug goes,
yeah.
Is there any future plan to integrate the debug, like logging onto Ambari instead of going
So the question is if there's a future plan to try to integrate the logs holistically into the workflow manager. And I think that's actually a great Jira to open with the Ambari project and say, hey, you know what? I'd really love one pane of glass to look at all my logs. Now that said, Oozie's actually done some work, and if you go back to the complaint slide, Artem, if that's possible, Oozie's done some work outside of Workflow Manager to try to make logs much easier. And this is really from a holistic systems to job level kind of vision. But the easy access to log files, there's now a diagnostic tool in Oozie 5. Oozie 2296 will have more descriptions on it. But that you can actually run a single command and it bundles everything up into a single, I think, tarball, if I recall right, for all of the Oozie errors at that point, the yarn errors and all of that being lumped into one artifact. So,
and in terms of what do I debug? Is this a problem with the UI? Is it a problem with the job? So Workflow Manager has its own log, right? You can go there and debug that, right? So you will obviously see errors on the web UI for that, but
I think that's a rich conversation to open up. So
exactly.
If you would certainly go to the Ambari project, say, hey, look, certainly with the MapReduce jobs, it can be frustrating when you want to look at a Spark action job, and so you look at your launcher to figure out what yarn job your Spark job was, to then look at its logs. And then maybe you realize your job properties just had a bug, and you have to then look at your Oozie job log to see that error.
And not just logs, right? Metrics. I would like to publish my metrics from Oozie into AMS, for example, right? So it has, communities working on re-implementing the metrics API in the later releases, and I would like to see that in AMS, for example, right? So that's something also to think about.
I think one of the key things that's been really, really awesome to see is just the rapidity of change recently. I think Artem and I, back in May it was, looked at Oozie 5 had just released. Oozie 5.1 now is kind of getting solidified. I think there's 45 JIRAs that have gone into that, ranging from things like the Fluent Jobs API, which is not a small change by any stretch, to a number of other very exciting things. So certainly ideas are welcome.
And one thing to touch that, starting with the 5X releases, the community is working on really fast cadence of releasing new minor releases, right? So 5.1 will be somewhere in July, August time. 5.0 was released in April, and then you can expect at least one more release this year, right? And they're just crunching through the JIRAs to implement new features and look at what the other ecosystem projects are doing and, just attacking those vectors. And by we forgot to mention that neither one of us is a committer on the project. Yes. We do take, things for granted here, but on the behalf of the community, we're just trying to evangelize this.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool. Thank you guys very much.